Today, I am excited to share with you all the first true crime case I will be covering. The Boogeyman of Melbourne, better known as Mr. Cruel. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, the city of Melbourne, Australia, was gripped by an unspeakable terror. A shadowy figure, known only as Mr. Cruel, lurked in the darkness, stalking the streets and leaving a trail of violence and despair in his wake. Over the course of several years, this sadistic criminal would kidnap, torture, and murder, all while taunting the police and evading capture. His twisted acts of brutality left not only his victims and their families shattered, but also an entire community paralyzed with fear. The story of Mr. Cruel is one that still haunts the minds of those who lived through it, a chilling reminder of the darkness that still lurks freely in the shadows of our world. Melbourne, a vibrant and bustling city in the late 1980s and early 1990s, was a place where families thrived and communities flourished. The city's suburbs, with their tree-lined streets and neatly kept gardens, painted a picture of tranquility and safety. Children played together in the parks, and neighbors chatted over backyard fences, creating a strong sense of camaraderie and trust. But beneath the idyllic surface, something sinister was brewing, a malevolent force that would forever change the lives of those who called Melbourne home. As the sun set on Melbourne's quiet suburban neighborhoods, the ominous pall cast by Mr. Cruel's presence loomed over the unsuspecting residents. They went about their daily routines, unaware of the horrors that lurked just beyond their doors. The streets, once a haven for laughter and play, became the hunting ground for a predator who preyed on some of the most vulnerable among them: young girls. As his infamy grew, so did the sense of dread that permeated the air. People began to lock their doors, install security systems, and question their neighbors, desperate to unmask the monster in their midst. But despite their best efforts, Mr. Cruel remained elusive, a phantom that struck without warning and vanished without a trace. And as the city held its breath, waiting for his next move, the true depth of his depravity would come to light, revealing a horror that defied all understanding. As Mr. Cruel's horrifying crimes became public knowledge, the once peaceful suburbs were transformed into places of anxiety and suspicion. The laughter of children playing outdoors was replaced by hushed whispers of fearful parents, warning them to stay close to home. Windows were now shuttered and doors locked tight as families attempted to create a barrier between themselves and the evil that lurked just out of sight. Trust among neighbors began to erode, replaced by a nagging doubt that anyone could be the monster hiding in plain sight. The once close-knit communities were now fractured, held captive by the terrifying specter of Mr. Cruel. Melbourne, a city that had once been a sanctuary for its residents, had now become a chilling stage for a horrifying drama that would unfold over the course of several years, leaving an indelible mark on the city's collective psyche. Before we continue, I want you to close your eyes and imagine for just a moment. You are lying in bed, feeling safe and secure in the familiar surroundings of your own home. The darkness of the night surrounds you, and you drift off to sleep, unaware of the terror that awaits. Suddenly, you're jolted awake by an unfamiliar noise. Your heart races as you try to make sense of the situation, only to realize that a masked intruder stands at the foot of your bed. Panic sets in, and you desperately want to scream for help, but the chilling sight of a knife in one of the intruder's hands and a gun in the other forces you to remain silent. As the intruder binds your hands and feet, tapes over your eyes, and gags you with a ball, you're overwhelmed by a sense of vulnerability and helplessness. You're forcibly removed from the safety of your home, the place where you should feel most secure, and taken to an unknown location. The feeling of disorientation and dread is palpable as you realize that your life is now in the hands of a sadistic predator. In your heart, you're screaming for help, longing for your parents, but you're painfully aware that no one can hear your silent pleas. The darkness that surrounds you is suffocating as the intruder subjects you to unspeakable acts of cruelty. Each minute feels like an eternity, and you wonder if you'll ever see your family again. You try to remain strong, but the relentless physical and emotional torment wears you down. You cling to memories of happier times, desperately searching for a source of strength and hope. You imagine your family's faces, and the thoughts of them keep you going, even as you feel the weight of your ordeal threatening to crush you. In those moments of abject terror, you can't help but feel utterly alone, a small, vulnerable child facing unimaginable darkness. The isolation is as much a part of your suffering as a physical pain, as you confront the reality that you are entirely at the mercy of a ruthless predator. Now, open your eyes and consider the experiences of Sharon, Nicola, and Carmen, who endured the horrors described above at the hands of Mr. Cruel. The unimaginable fear and anguish they experienced are a stark reminder of the profound suffering that can be inflicted upon the innocent, and the enduring impact of such acts of unspeakable evil. At roughly 4 a.m. on August 22, 1987, Mr. Cruel removed a pane of glass from a window and invaded a home in Melbourne's Lower Plenty, brandishing a knife and a handgun. He crept into the master bedroom, then forced the parents of 2 children onto their stomachs and tied their hands and feet together. He locked the adults in a wardrobe before binding their 7-year-old son to his bed with tape. After the rest of the family was bound, he assaulted their 11-year-old daughter for 2 hours. He left the house after chopping the phone lines, stealing vinyl records, and a blue coat. In December 1988, 10-year-old Sharon Willis became Mr. Cruel's first publicly identified victim. At 5:30 a.m., while her family slept, he broke into their Ringwood home through the back door. He bound and gagged Sharon's parents, disabled their phone lines, and abducted the young girl. For 18 harrowing hours, Sharon endured unimaginable torment at the hands of Mr. Cruel before being released, alive but forever changed, at a nearby high school wrapped in a green garbage bag. Sharon would give a testimony that would provide investigators with crucial insight into Mr. Cruel's modus operandi, including his penchant for cleanliness, his use of tape to bind his victims, and his disturbing practice of meticulously bathing them before releasing them. Despite these clues, just over a year and a half later, the monster struck again. In July 1990, Mr. Cruel targeted 13-year-old Nicola Linus, who lived in the affluent suburb of Canterbury. Just before midnight, he broke into the Linus family home, brandishing a knife and a handgun, and wearing a balaclava to hide his identity. He instructed Nicola to go into another room to pick up her school uniform while he tied up her older sister Fiona in her bed. Over the course of 50 hours, Mr. Cruel held Nicola captive, subjecting her to unspeakable acts of torture and abuse. Miraculously, Nicola was released alive, albeit severely traumatized, by her captor, who dumped her at a power substation. Nicola's brave testimony provided law enforcement with a detailed account of her ordeal. While the full details of Nicola Linus's and Sharon Willis's testimonies are not publicly available, they did provide crucial information that helped investigators in their attempt to identify and apprehend Mr. Cruel. Some key points from their testimonies include both victims describing their captors as someone who took great care to cover his tracks. He carefully cleaned the crime scenes and bathed the girls before releasing them, in an effort to remove any potential forensic evidence. Both Nicola and Sharon reported that Mr. Cruel wore a balaclava or some kind of face covering, making it impossible for them to see his face and identify him. The girls both described Mr. Cruel's voice as having an Australian accent, and he seemed to be well-spoken and articulate. He issued threats and demands in a calm and controlled manner, which further contributed to the terror they experienced during their abductions. Both girls were blindfolded during their abductions in captivity, making it difficult for them to provide specific details about the locations where they were held. However, they did describe certain aspects, such as the presence of a room with a bath or a shower, which Mr. Cruel used to clean them before releasing them. Nicola's and Sharon's testimonies helped investigators establish a pattern in Mr. Cruel's methods. He targeted young girls in their homes while their families slept. He would bind and gag the parents or siblings to prevent them from interfering. Although Nicola Linus and Sharon Wills provided valuable information about their horrifying experiences, their testimonies would fail to lead to the capture of Mr. Cruel. A mere 9 months after Nicola, Carmen Chan, a 13-year-old girl with a bright future ahead of her, became one of Mr. Cruel's most tragic victims. On the fateful night of April 13th, 1991, Carmen was abducted from her family home in the suburb of Templestowe while babysitting her 2 younger sisters. Mr. Cruel broke into the house, blindfolded, and locked Carmen's sisters in a wardrobe before disappearing with Carmen. Before leaving, the offender spray-painted "Asian drug deal, payback, and more to come" on a vehicle in the Chan's front yard. Police suspect this was a ruse to distract them from identifying him and linking this abduction to his earlier crimes. As days turned into weeks and then months, Carmen's family and the community desperately searched for her, hoping against hope that she would be found alive. But their worst fears were confirmed on April 9th, 1992, when Carmen's remains were discovered in a landfill in the nearby suburb of Thomastown. She had been shot 3 times in the head, a chilling indication of Mr. Cruel's merciless nature. During the investigation, police discovered evidence that suggested Mr. Cruel had been monitoring the Chan family for some time, including a pair of binoculars and a stolen car found near the crime scene. Despite this, the authorities were unable to identify Carmen's abductor, and her case remains unsolved. While Carmen, Nicola, and Sharon are the most well-known victims of Mr. Cruel, there are other cases that may be linked to the notorious predator. These include the unsolved cases of several other young girls who were abducted and assaulted in the Melbourne area during the same period. However, due to lack of definitive evidence, it remains uncertain whether these crimes were the work of Mr. Cruel or other criminals acting independently. In response to the growing public fear and pressure to apprehend Mr. Cruel, law enforcement agencies formed Task Force Spectrum in 1991. This dedicated task force, comprised of seasoned detectives and experts from various fields, was assigned to the sole mission of identifying and capturing the elusive predator. Task Force Spectrum was provided with significant resources, including access to state-of-the-art forensic technology and the expertise of criminal profilers in an effort to bring the reign of terror to an end. Throughout the investigation, Task Force Spectrum pursued numerous leads and developed several theories about the identity and motives of Mr. Cruel. Some of the key leads and theories included the fact that Mr. Cruel seemed to know when and where law enforcement would be during his crimes, led investigators to believe that he may have been using police scanners to monitor their movements, or that he may have been a member of law enforcement. Mr. Cruel is believed to have a deep understanding of forensic science, as he was meticulous in concealing evidence. He left virtually no physical evidence at the crime scenes, leading some to theorize that he might have had professional training or background in police methods or forensic science. Another theory, based on his modus operandi, suggests that he may have been involved in education or child-related work. In some instances, he appeared to have specific knowledge about the children he targeted, and he seemed to exhibit patience, control, and manipulation techniques typical of someone accustomed to dealing with children. There is also a theory that Mr. Cruel may have been in the telecommunications or electrical industries. He knew how to identify and disable phone lines easily, and all of his victims were abducted or released near electrical substations. As the case gained national and international attention, the media played a significant role in both informing the public about the ongoing investigation and shaping public perception of Mr. Cruel. News outlets reported on the latest developments in the case, shared composite sketches of the suspect, and interviewed experts about possible motives and the likelihood of his capture. While the media coverage undoubtedly helped raise awareness about the case and may have contributed to the pressure on law enforcement to solve it, it also served to heighten the sense of fear and anxiety among Melbourne residents. The constant reminders of Mr. Cruel's brutal crimes and his continued evasion of the authorities fueled the public's growing sense of unease and paranoia. As Task Force Spectrum investigated Mr. Cruel's crimes, several potential suspects and persons of interest emerged. Some of the most notable suspects included Brian Elkner, a former teacher and registered sex offender, was considered a possible suspect in the Mr. Cruel case. His background and history of sexual offenses against children raised suspicions about his potential involvement. Background and possible motives. Elkner had a history of sexual offenses against minors, and his former occupation as a teacher may have provided him with the access to vulnerable targets. Furthermore, he had an intimate knowledge of the Melbourne area and its suburbs. Evidence against him. Elkner was arrested in 1989 for the abduction and sexual assault of a 13-year-old girl, a crime that bore similarities to Mr. Cruel's modus operandi. Additionally, Elkner's physical appearance reportedly matched the composite sketches of Mr. Cruel. Reasons for doubt. Despite the circumstantial evidence and similarities between Elkner's crimes and those of Mr. Cruel, no concrete evidence directly linked him to the abductions and murder. Elkner was eventually ruled out as a suspect by the police. Robert Keith Knight, a notorious Australian pedophile, was another suspect in the Mr. Cruel case. Knight was arrested in 1991 for the abduction and sexual assault of a 12-year-old girl. Knight had a long history of sexual abuse, and his criminal record showed a pattern for escalating violence. His experience as a cable splicer would have provided him with the technical knowledge needed to disable phone lines during Mr. Cruel's attacks. Knight's criminal history and background in telecommunications raised suspicions about his possible involvement in the Mr. Cruel case. Furthermore, Knight bore a strong resemblance to the composite sketches of the suspect. Although Knight was considered a person of interest, no definitive evidence linked him to the Mr. Cruel crimes. Eventually, he was convicted of an unrelated abduction and sexual assault and sentenced to life in prison. The last suspect I will mention is Joseph James DeAngelo, better known as the Golden State Killer. Although it seems unlikely, the Golden State Killer of California, United States, was also Mr. Cruel, there are a few interesting facts that make it possible. The year after the California murders ended, Mr. Cruel emerged in Australia. He also has a link to Australia as he served aboard the USS Canberra, which had taken him to Australia at one point during his tour of duty. Both killers broke into homes wearing a mask and claimed they were there to rob the victims. They both had long hair, and they would take breaks during attacks to eat food from the victim's kitchen. They were both also pathologically meticulous. Those significant similarities aside, Victoria police ruled out the Golden State Killer as he had never abducted any of his victims. Throughout the investigation, Task Force Spectrum identified and questioned numerous other potential suspects and persons of interest, but no individual was ever definitively linked to the Mr. Cruel crimes. Despite the efforts of Task Force Spectrum, the leads they pursued, and the increased media attention, the leads eventually went cold. The task force was disbanded in 1994, leaving the case unsolved. As I'm sure you could imagine, the impact of Mr. Cruel's crimes extended far beyond the physical harm inflicted upon his victims. His reign of terror left deep psychological scars on the entire community of Melbourne, forever altering the way people perceived their once safe neighborhoods. The physical and psychological trauma endured by Mr. Cruel's victims was immense, leaving them with deep emotional scars that would likely never fully heal. Kidnapped, tortured, and abused, these young girls experienced unimaginable terrors that will haunt them for the rest of their lives. Coping with the aftermath of their ordeal, they faced a long and arduous journey towards recovery, struggling to regain a sense of normalcy and control over their lives. The trauma also extended to the girls' families, who were forced to confront the unimaginable pain of having their loved ones subjected to such brutality. The intense media scrutiny surrounding Mr. Cruel's crimes added an additional layer of stress to the victims and their families. As they attempted to process their grief and trauma, they found themselves thrust into the spotlight, their personal stories dissected by journalists and the public alike. The constant reminders of the atrocities they had endured only served to exacerbate the psychological wounds, making it even more challenging to move forward and rebuild their lives. The terror inflicted by Mr. Cruel had a profound impact on the relationships with the victims' families and their broader communities. Trust, once a cornerstone of these close-knit neighborhoods, was eroded as people began to question whether they could truly rely on one another for support and protection. This loss of trust extended to the families themselves, as parents grappled with feelings of guilt and helplessness, questioning their ability to keep their children safe from harm. Siblings, too, were affected, as the shared experience of trauma created both a deep bond and a painful reminder of the horrors they had survived. A significant note of the case that is less known comes from forensic psychologist Tim Watson Monroe. He worked on the Mr. Cruel case, contracted by Victorian police. He stated he did not believe the offender had a specific attraction to prepubescent children. Monroe said investigators had asked him to profile Mr. Cruel's offenses, which included adult women not widely known to the public. He suggests Mr. Cruel had become desensitized to the extreme sadism and brutality he inflicted upon those adult victims and turned to children to satisfy his perverted desires. The following are Munro's own words on the case. I was retained by the Victorian Police Force to assist in profiling an offender operating in the northern suburbs of Melbourne who was abducting women or breaking into their houses, tying them up and assaulting them. There was a lot of publicity about the schoolgirls, but before them, there was one case, one of several police sent me, and she was an elderly nun, and he broke into her house in the Mooney Ponds area and assaulted her. His targets were not just kids. He was not just a pedophile, and I think he was a person who got off on the adrenaline and excitement of the power. So, it collectively impacted upon the psyche of Melbourne and young families, including my own, and I think we had a bit of vicarious post-traumatic stress. It was like the Boogeyman, literally. You didn't know when he was going to strike, where he was going to strike, whether he was watching you. Munro had suggested criminals like Mr. Cruel tend to keep offending. They may choose another killing ground if something went wrong, but generally, the drive is so overpowering that no amount of self-restraint could last for nearly 30 years. Munro has offered that Mr. Cruel may have died or been jailed for other offenses without police realizing, but it is more likely he changed his methods or location. Numerous unanswered questions linger, leaving both investigators and the public grappling with the unknown. Who was Mr. Cruel, and what drove him to commit such heinous acts? Did he stop committing crimes, or did he simply become more adept at evading capture? Is he still alive, perhaps living in anonymity among the very people he once terrorized? The case of Mr. Cruel has left an indelible mark on the people of Melbourne and the world of criminal investigation. It has become a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dark depths to which human beings are capable of traversing, and the fragility of the safeties we perceive ourselves to have. The lessons learned from the case have shaped the way law enforcement approaches similar crimes, with an emphasis on victim support, advanced forensic techniques, and a greater understanding of the complexities of criminal psychology. While the identity of Mr. Cruel may never be uncovered, the memory of his crimes and the indomitable spirit of those who survived his brutality will continue to serve as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable darkness. Have you come across any facts that I missed? Perhaps you have personal theories on the case. I would love to hear them, so drop them in the comment section. Moreover, I genuinely want to hear your thoughts on the video. What resonated with you? What did you like? Areas I can improve upon? Or any other insights you wish to share? Your feedback is always appreciated. Lastly, if you did like this video, help out the channel by subscribing, checking out some of my other content, and maybe sharing your favorite with your friends and family. I sincerely appreciate everyone's support and give my thanks to all of you.